Good evening. It's wonderful to be here with you tonight. This is somewhat of a homecoming for me. I was telling Father that in grad school, one of my first internships was actually at Alpha Omega across the parking lot, and we used to do a lot of the marriage prep, the three to get married encounters right here. So I came in and he said, does anything look different? I said, well, the podium is almost exactly the same. So this podium and I are very familiar. So the TV has definitely upgraded in the last 12 years. So, as Father said, I'm a clinical psychologist working with Catholic Charities of the Diocese of Arlington. And prior to that, I worked in radio and television for a number of years. That was sort of my first career. And bringing that experience and that interest into psychology has really manifested in a specific focus and interest on how do people communicate? And how does technology impact our relationships? How is it that it changes what we take for granted and influence the connections between us in ways that we may not even be aware of? I've been married for more than 10 years at this point, and we have 3 children, which you'll be hearing about throughout the presentation. I'll start, though, with a story. I was playing with my son a couple years ago. He's now 8, he was 2 at the time. And we were having a picnic, a pretend picnic for his stuffed animals. And at the end of this, he took a wooden banana and he held it up to the side of his head. And he says, "Hello, Daddy, are you having a nice time?" And I thought to myself, oh, a banana phone, sure, okay. So I put my finger and my pinky up to my head and I play along. I said, "Yes, I'm having a great time." He said, "Oh, good, I'm so happy you're here with me. Hold on." And he points the banana at me, and he says, "Geez," say cheese, click. I said, "Wait, what'd you just do?" He said, "Hold on." And he starts swiping his finger across the curve of the banana. And he says, "I took your picture, and now I will text it to you." Now, what was really terrifying for me about this was we didn't have a smartphone at the time. We didn't have an iPad. By my count, my son had seen a smartphone maybe twice, for less than 10 minutes a time. And from that, he had figured out that a phone isn't just for talking on, it's for taking pictures, and somehow, by magically wiggling your fingers across the screen, it's for sending pictures. This was a huge wake-up call to me in terms of what children assume is normal and how sensitive they are to technology in their assumptions of what is normal. That actually was the start of a very long professional series of me of getting interested in this topic, talking about this topic, and ultimately writing about this topic, which Father mentioned in the book that just came out with our Sunday Visitor called The Tech Talk, which is available upstairs. I'd like to quote a book called Technopoly, an author named Neil Postman. He says in this book, "One significant change can generate total change. If you remove caterpillars from a given environment, you are not left with the same habitat minus caterpillars. You have a new environment, and you have reconstituted the conditions of survival. The same is true if you add caterpillars to an environment that has had none." He goes on to say that a new technology does not add or subtract something, it changes everything. This is the world that we're raising our kids in. So we must be incredibly aware as parents of the role that technology plays in influencing our children's view of the world, but also how it influences our families and how we interact. Over 150 years ago, Henry David Thoreau, in his book Walden, had a quote talking about the telegraph, which had just come out. He said, "We are in great haste to construct a magnetic telegraph from Maine to Texas. But Maine and Texas, it may be, have nothing of importance to communicate." 154 years ago, Thoreau is recognizing that information without context isn't particularly helpful. He was talking specifically about the idea that people in Texas now can find out if it's raining in Maine. Who cares? What specific impact does it have on people in Texas in 1854 if it's raining somewhere else? It's simply information. But this also is part of the environment that we live in. We have disjointed information and just floods and floods of information that may not be specifically relevant if it doesn't have an appropriate context. So let's talk a little bit about social media. What is social media? If we were to create a definition of social media, it might sound something like this. It's interactions among people in which they create, share, and exchange information and ideas in virtual communities and networks. It allows for the creation and exchange of user-generated content. And the rate with which we as a country are engaging in social media is, quite frankly, astounding. Let me give you some stats. I'm a psychologist. I like stats. I'm a nerd. I'm okay with that. I also like baseball a lot and advanced metrics. My wife is very patient. There was a 37% increase in the time spent on social media in this country from July of 2011 to July of 2012. And in July of 2012, 121 billion minutes of time was spent solely on social media. 121 billion minutes. Now, for those of you very quickly doing the math, that's roughly the equivalent of 2,302 years of time spent on social media in this country alone in 1 month 6 years ago. That number has not decreased. In fact, some of the statistics that I found while researching my book, the Tech Talk that I quote, is that according to Nielsen's social media report in 2016, in the US alone, there was an additional 36% increase in time spent on social media from 2015 to 2016. In 2016, the Global Web Index reported that the average internet user spent 2.1 hours per day on social networking sites, up from 1.6 hours in 2012. And again, this is just social media. This is not counting any other internet sites or any other computer-based activities. And currently, my favorite statistic on social media is that based on the usage rates last year in 2017, the average person in the United States will spend 5 years and 4 months of their life on social media. This is the equivalent of the time that it would take to walk across the country 13 times. And this is the average. Again, we're seeing trends. This is not decreasing. This is continuing to increase as this becomes the norm for how we engage each other, for how we interact. And as we go on in this talk in a little bit, we'll talk about what does that mean? If we're spending 5 years, 4 months of our life engaged in social media, what are we not doing in those 5 years and 4 months of our life? Let's talk now about some of the popular sites that are out there today. Obviously, we all know about Facebook. Facebook is a personalized web page, and on Facebook's little introduction, it states that it will allow users to continuously stay in touch with friends, relatives, and other acquaintances wherever they are in the world, as long as there is internet. It unites people with common interests and or beliefs through groups and other pages. Sounds really nice, and we'll talk about some of the concerns about that in a little bit. Other things are like YouTube, which is video sharing, Twitter, which is a microblog, limited to 140 characters, Tumblr, Instagram, Snapchat, WhatsApp. Now, if you haven't heard of all of these things, I guarantee your kids have. One of the things that a parent asked me once was, can you give us a rundown of all of the social media apps that are currently in use today? And the answer, no. Because by the time I finished giving that list, 2 of them would become defunct and 2 new ones would come on. This is, more or less to say we have to be aware of what it is our kids are doing, what they're engaged in. Because the landscape is changing honestly faster than we can keep up. Let me take a step back. We're talking about the importance of social media and its impact on communication. So let's spend a minute or two talking about communication. This was really what got me interested in the idea of technology, working as a psychologist, trying to understand how do we relate? How do we connect with one another? How do we understand one another? And communication happens on 4 different levels. The first level is verbal. It's what are people saying? It's the transcript of what it is that I'm saying now. If you were to write what was being said, this is the verbal level of communication. The second is tone of voice, not just what you're saying, but how you're saying it. So my 8th grade algebra teacher, a man named Mr. Morton, fantastic teacher, really, really gifted man, and one of the crankiest people I've ever met in my entire life. And he would just sort of berate the class pretty regularly. And I came home one day and I was complaining to my mom. I said, Mr. Morton is just such a jerk. Now my mother, who is much more charitable than I am, said, oh, come on, Michael. Look, maybe he was having a bad day. Maybe you misunderstood what he was saying. Why don't you do this? Why don't you go ahead and tell me exactly what it is that Mr. Morton said, but say it in a really nice way and see if it sounds any better. So I went, okay, Mom. You were the worst algebra class I've ever had the misfortune to teach in 3 years. It's incredible your parents haven't disowned you yet. And if any of you have a future brighter than shaking fries somewhere, I frankly will be amazed. At this point, my mom recognized that, yeah, maybe Mr. Morton sometimes, had some difficulties expressing love and affirmation for people. So those are the first 2 levels of communication, the verbal level and tone of voice. The next is facial expressions. It's what's going on as we're saying something, because there is a tremendous difference if I say to my brother, yeah, I really like your hat, versus, yeah, I really like your hat. It sounds about the same, but clearly what I'm conveying in my face is something completely different. I don't actually care for my brother's hat all that much. The fourth is body language. So not just what's going on in our face, but what's going on in our entire bodies. When I was in grad school, I tutored at an SAT prep company that was owned by a Korean family, and many of the students that I worked with were Korean. And to be completely candid, I did not know an awful lot about the Korean culture at that time. So I was diligently going and giving all these kids all these practice exams for math, and finally my boss came up one day and said, Michael, you gotta stop giving these kids all these practice exams. I said, why? I'm asking them, and they're saying, yeah. I'll say, hey, do you want to do another practice exam? And they're saying, yes. And my boss said, no, they're not. They're saying, yes, and putting their head down. In Korea, if you say yes and put your head down, what you're really saying is no. Now, culturally sensitive person that I was, completely unaware of that, so I'm overloading these poor kids with materials. I was unaware of what the communication was on that bodily level. Now here's where things get interesting. When we start talking about how we talk, what it is we say, and how the other person receives what we have to say. When we talk, when we speak, I, as the speaker, put the majority of my emphasis in the verbal level, what is actually being said. And I assume that you, as the listener, will also take the most information out of that verbal level. And we don't. As receivers, we go backwards. As receivers, we look first at body language, then at facial expressions, then at tone of voice, and then and only then do we get to the context of what is actually being said as we decipher what the intent of the message is. That's how we trust things. You can immediately see difficulties, though, when you start to strip away those levels of communication through social media, through technology. When you don't have face-to-face communication, you are losing multiple levels. On the phone, you're going to get what's said, and you're going to get the tone. You miss everything else. On text messages, you get none of that, other than sometimes it's a very disjointed and auto-corrected version of the message. And I'm sorry, but emoticons and emojis are not sufficient in terms of conveying actual meaning and actual intent. There's something important about being present to someone. If I proposed to my wife via text and said, will you, single letter, marry me, smiley face, she's going to respond, LOL, no, and then unfriend me on Facebook. I wouldn't go ahead and ask those really important things without being there. The idea of being there matters. How many times do we find ourselves saying when a friend or a loved one is in trouble, God, I wish I could just be there. I wish I could be with you. What is it about being with someone that is so important? It's the recognition that a genuine encounter, which we'll talk about in a little bit, a genuine encounter requires that we are there and present to the other person. That encounter cannot be mediated through technology. It does not fulfill and satisfy those desires that God placed on our heart to be in a relationship. At this point, it's probably important for me to say that I'm not a Luddite, I'm not anti-technology, I really don't want people to go home and throw their phones out the window on $4.95. But we have to recognize that technology has a place. Technology has to be the steward of our relationships, not the source of our relationships. What do I mean by that? If we have a relationship that is pre-existing outside of the technology, then of course using technology to strengthen that relationship is great. My brother and his wife just moved to Tokyo about a year ago. Now prior to that, he and I had not lived in the same time zone probably in 20 years. But we would see each other, 4 or 5 times a year. He and my kids are very close. His wife and my wife are good friends. Really, these are important relationships in our life. And I would be lying to you if when he called and said, hey, I got the Tokyo job, part of me was happy for him because I knew this was a great thing for his career. He's always wanted to live in Japan. But part of me was really worried. How's this going to work? How can we possibly go ahead and continue the closeness of the relationship that we have when you are trans-Pacific, when you are 13 time zones away from us? Well, we Facebook. We don't Facebook, I'm sorry. We Skype, we FaceTime. So the video conferencing actually is a really helpful thing. So that way we can see the dogs that they're fostering. They can see the cat my kids got at Christmas. My kids can go and have that relationship with their aunt and uncle. But it's because we don't have the opportunity to be face-to-face. We would rather be face-to-face. He's coming at Easter, we're delighted. But the technology helps maintain the relationship when a physical proximity is not possible. If I'm to be really honest, one of the things I love the most is that my brother and I have the same board games, and he will set up his and I will sync up mine, and we will play board games across video conferencing. Again, my wife is incredibly patient, and she just sort of rolls her eyes and sighs and goes upstairs and does something worthwhile while we giggle like 8-year-olds and eat popcorn and play these games. But this is how we're able to keep our relationship together when the alternatives are to have very little face-to-face interaction at all. So these are pre-existing relationships. Technology like social media is a great way also to disseminate information quickly. My parents live north of Houston. I finished high school in Houston. I grew up in London, that's a different story. But I finished high school in Houston, went to the University of Texas. All of my very dear friends are in Houston. And in August, when Hurricane Harvey was flooding the city at a biblical rate, it was really nice to occasionally get little tweets or text messages just, hey, we're safe, we're dry, water's coming up the steps, but we're okay. That was fantastic. And that way I could keep in touch with the dozens of people who I love and was concerned about without actually needing to go and try to get through to every single one of them every single night. So those little blasts were very helpful. Again, we wouldn't say that's a real deepening of the relationship, but it's a great way to know that the people we care about are safe. But let's talk about the negatives of social media. Let's talk about the costs. One of the biggest challenges that I see, both in terms of the research I've done, but also professionally in the families and the kids that I have worked with in my practice at Catholic Charities of the Diocese of Arlington, is that there's a lack of genuine interaction when all of our relationships are mediated through social media. We are not connecting, or at least not connecting in a satisfying way. We blend the concept of friends and strangers. It drives me crazy that in Facebook, to be connected to someone is to call them a friend. Well, ask yourself this. How many of you have Facebook accounts? Raise your hands. All right. Put your hands down. Now, if you can in all honesty, say that every single one of your friends on Facebook is somebody that you have looked eye to eye with in person, hugged, shaken hands with, sat next to? Raise your hands. 2 people. What are we doing? Who are these people we are calling our friends? Are these actual friends? Are these people that we sincerely have a relationship with? Or are these people who we might have some sort of mutual interest connected with, but don't really know each other? Why does that become problematic when our kids are involved? What's the one thing that parents, since the dawn of time, have said to their children before dropping them off at the mall or anywhere else? Don't talk to strangers. What are we allowing to take place in our homes? We're so concerned about our children talking to strangers out in public, but what are we sanctioning in our own homes when we are not sure who these people are who our kids are talking to online? If we don't have a good handle on who their friends are, how can we have confidence that the relationships they are engaged in are healthy and Christ-centered? I mentioned earlier, when we talk about that 5 years, 4 months that people are online, every minute, every hour that we choose to be engaged in social media is a minute or an hour that we are choosing to not do something else. I have seen multiple occasions, and I'm sure you have too, of people staring at their phones while sitting next to each other. You can have people in a room all sort of disengaged in their own thing and not actually interacting with the people who are right there in front of us. So the people that we are connecting with, we're not actually face-to-face with. And yet the people who are right there in our lives, we're choosing not to engage with. If we're not actually taking the time to connect and engage as families, this can become problematic. Something that I'm currently on a very small crusade about, and I've been giving more talks in the area about this recently. The idea of the good Catholic family, to me, needs to go. I don't know what a good Catholic family is, because this is what I have seen time and time again in my office. People will come in and talk about the distress that their families experience and say, but people think we're such a good Catholic family. We're there on time, sitting at the front of the church, and everybody's pristine. And, you know, it's not like some other families of mine who are racing the priest sort of down the aisle, kind of scrambling in, making a small circus of ourselves. You know, if you're so concerned, or if people are so concerned about appearances, but then, after being in public, looking like a well-polished group, everybody goes home and scatters, and there's no connection, and you get 4 or 5 independent people sharing a roof and a mailing address, and that's it. To me, that's not our goal. That's not what we hope for. We don't want good Catholic families. We want engaged Catholic families. We want families that are legitimately connected, that are legitimately interested in the well-being and flourishing of the other, where there are genuine encounters with the other person, in which we are actively seeing the face of Christ in them and seeking to show the face of Christ to them. This is what we want our families, our relationships, to truly be. And we can't do that if everybody is split up doing their own thing, staring at whatever glowing screen they happen to be looking at. Other challenges in social media is that our identity becomes flexible. In social media, the other person is simply who they say they are. We have no way to verify it. So if I were to go online and say, well, I'm 6'6", I've got a full head of hair, looks a bit like George Clooney's more attractive younger brother. Well, no, I don't. I'm 5'8" with a back that's questionable and bald, and I could lose about 20 pounds. That's the reality. Not what I would wish to be, not what I would say that I am. But again, if we don't know who we are talking to, if we don't have the convenience of natural law and reality right there, we don't know who we're talking to. And it's very easy to get wrapped up in this idea of who do you want to be, as opposed to who God made you. Even the nature of communication shifts. There's less discourse and more broadcast. What is Twitter but a very small telegraph just sending things out? It's not necessarily about discourse, it's just, here's what I think about this. Here's a picture of my lunch. I had a great sandwich. these are just sort of the ways that we're engaging, but again, with what purpose? Is it trying to deepen a relationship, or is it just, here's me, here's me, here's me, everybody? So what is it that we're hoping to do? There's a sociologist at MIT, her name is Sherry Turkle, and she's got a brilliant quote about the impact social media has on our interactions. She says, and I quote, "We expect more from technology and less from each other. We design technologies that will give the illusion of companionship without the demands of friendship." What a great line. The illusion of companionship without the demands of friendship. We don't want to be alone, but we don't want to work. We don't want to have to actually take the time to go and apologize when things get difficult, or work through the difficult situations which naturally occur in relationships where there is meaning and depth. Because it's easier just to keep things shallow. It's easier to keep things on the surface and tweet pictures of our sandwiches without actually engaging in the richness that true friendship can bring. So going back to my son, if children start to think that technology is naturally the way the world should be, if they take that for granted, what is their expectation of relationships? What is their expectation of friendships? And what are we doing within the context of our families to give a model of genuine friendship, of genuine encounters? One of the things we're seeing an increase in, from a clinical perspective, is with teenagers in particular, there's a tremendous rise of anxiety regarding these relationships that are primarily driven by social media, because the relationships themselves are unstable. There was a professor at the Rochester Institute of Technology named Evan Selinger, and he was quoted in a Wired article in 2013 saying, "The very second that we become boring, the moment that we make communication anything more than a self-satisfying convenience, we would be abandoned by fair-weather friends. No explanation necessary, no apologies given, no attempt to blunt the hurt feelings, just an easy check of the unfriend box." Think of the pressure this puts on kids, particularly teenagers. I have had young men and young women sit in my office say things like, "But I have to be interesting. But I always have to be on and funny. Because if I'm not, who's going to pay attention to me? Who's going to like me?" If this is sort of the driving force for our friendships and relationships, you can see the incredible anxiety that builds up. If you're not interesting and fascinating and perfect all the time, everyone will leave you. That's far more pressure for a 14-year-old than I think we really need for them. Another phenomenon we've seen is something called Facebook envy. This is an actual clinical term, Facebook envy. And what Facebook envy is, it's jealousy or anxiety about other people having a better life than us based on what we see on their social media sites. This is the grass is greener on the other side in 2018. Now let's be honest for a second. Social media is just PR. On my Facebook page, I am not going to post the pictures of me mid-sneeze. I'm going to post the really attractive pictures of me. I am not going to talk about the really boring stuff I did. I stayed up until 1 o'clock in the morning Monday doing my taxes. I am not going to brag about that on Facebook. Or you're not going to say, "Hey, Saturday night, really clean those bathrooms. Ooh, it looks good." Unless I really am weird, I'm not going to put that out there as sort of me at my most glamorous. But when you have people, especially teenagers, coming in saying, "Oh my gosh, it looks like Steve just skydives all the time. And he met 4 celebrities. I've never met a celebrity." Yeah, but it doesn't talk about the time Steve did his algebra homework or failed his Spanish exam, because that's not what Steve is putting out there. We start to see very select snippets of other people's lives and think that our own are lacking in comparison. Something I think that we must talk about when we're talking about social media technology and kids is cyberbullying. Cyberbullying is an increasingly growing problem, and in one of my numerous iterations professionally before sort of growing up and settling on this one, I taught for a while, and also was a school counselor for a while, right when cyberbullying was starting to become a thing. And the schools could not get a handle on cyberbullying, and this is why. Well, but it didn't happen at school. Yeah, sure, they went home and they texted this back and forth, or this happened on somebody's email or somebody's Facebook page. But we can't control it because it's happening outside of school grounds, outside of school hours, off school grounds. Yeah, but you know what? Those kids come back in and they see each other the next day. So there's all sorts of disruption that is going on. And cyberbullying is the use of technology to intentionally harm another person. It could be direct aggressive actions in terms of making threatening statements. It can involve a person pretending to be someone else to trick another person. I talked earlier about this flexible identity. There's something called catfishing. Catfishing is when somebody pretends to be a different person who is romantically interested in whoever it is that they are chatting with. There were a number of high-profile cases, including one linebacker at Notre Dame a couple of years ago, that he was proposing to somebody online, and it turned out that not only was this person not existing, she might have actually been a man, and it became very complicated because you just don't know who you're talking to. The gentleman's name was Manti Te'o. I want to say it happened in 2013. Other things that cyberbullying can entail is spreading lies or rumors about another person, or posting pictures without consent of the other person. The internet is very challenging because one of the things that it is most difficult to monitor or control is once something is posted, it is out there forever. It's not the sort of thing like one incriminating piece of evidence that you can sort of gather and shred and destroy. It just replicates. Every time something gets sent or retweeted, it is out there forever. In fact, anything posted on social media, on Facebook, becomes the property of Facebook. And they will retain rights to that infinitely. Interesting story about that, actually. So my cousin lived in New Orleans, still lives in New Orleans, and following Hurricane Katrina, there was an HBO series that was made called Treme. And the opening sequence of Treme, actually, they wanted a whole bunch of pictures of different areas of New Orleans, photos taken by local artists and local photographers who were actually in New Orleans. You would not believe how difficult it was for HBO to find these pictures, because any photographer who posted that picture to Facebook no longer had the rights to their own picture to then turn around and sell to HBO. So HBO had to comb through and find pictures that had never been posted to any sort of social media site, so that the photographers actually still owned the rights to that original content. So this is all just to say anything that's out there, we don't have control over anymore, and it is not coming back. My college roommate is fond of saying that there's a generation of people in this country who will never be able to run for office because they went to college in the age of Facebook and Twitter. And all of those pictures of us at 20, which thank goodness are no longer available, for this generation will be available forever. So any sort of Google search of them will pop up all sorts of stuff. Now, back to cyberbullying. One of the biggest challenges, again, when we think about communication is this. There is a difference between the emotional intention of what we mean when we write something versus when we read something. When we write something, we are less emotionally involved. We write it and we just assume, well, okay, I'm upset, but I'm so angry at you, I can't believe you did that. Please never speak to me again. Jot it off, send it. Type it, send it. But when we read something, it has the same emotional impact as if we actually heard the person say it. So there can be this incredible disconnect of emotional intensity based on what one person meant and what the other person received. Statistically, boys initiate cyberbullying at an earlier age. However, by middle school, girls are much more likely to engage in cyberbullying than boys are. And there was a 2008 study that reported that 17% of middle school students reported being cyberbullied at least once in their lifetime. Now, because there are little ears in the room, I'm going to clean up the next section just a little bit, so read between the lines in terms of what we're talking about. There is a huge issue with the sending of inappropriate visual images, in terms of sending pictures that are not chaste. This continues to be a major issue, even though there are some pretty weighty legal ramifications. There was a 2012 study at the University of Utah that reported that 20% of teenagers aged 14 to 18 in this study sent a lewd and visually inappropriate image of themselves via cell phone. Nearly 40% of teenagers involved in this study reported receiving an explicit picture on their cell phone. 25% of this group who had received admitted that they forwarded that image on to other people, and 1/3 of that group did it even though they said at the time they knew that there would be serious ramifications if they were caught doing it. Now, I don't think they realize how serious the legal ramifications are. Legally, in this country, if a sexually inappropriate picture of a minor is sent via email or via text, that is considered trafficking of child pornography, even if the person sending it took the picture of themselves. So, we have to understand that when teenagers in particular are feeling pressured to send these pictures, or think that it in some way will strengthen a relationship or a commitment to an early romantic relationship, they have to understand the serious consequences, not just legally, but the impact that it has on them and their own dignity. What does that say about you if you're willing to send this inappropriate picture? And there are some cases in which kids are pressured specifically into sending these sort of pictures. There are a growing number of online predators who can hack into the built-in webcams on laptops, and in some cases the built-in cameras on iPads, and take pictures. And then message whatever teenager and say, hey, I've got this picture of you, and I'm going to send it to everyone at your school if you don't send me more. And the demands increase and get worse and get more graphic. And the fear and the shame of having something sent to the rest of their school or their peers becomes so paralyzing that many times these kids will not ask for help appropriately. They won't talk to parents. They may not even talk to their friends about this. So again, who are our children talking to? Are we letting strangers into our homes? Now, to be honest, as a father of 3 young children and 2 girls, I think about this stuff and I throw up in my mouth just a little bit. I get very worried about this and think, gosh, this is the world that we live in? Tell you what, let's just disconnect from everything, pack up and go live in a cave in the mountains somewhere, because that's the best way that I can keep you safe. And if I don't let anybody who doesn't have the same last name as you talk at you or look at you ever, whew, we'll all be okay. This is not practical. And it's also not what God calls us to. God doesn't call us to isolate and raise the drawbridges to the rest of the world. So there are things that we as parents can do to help our kids, A, stay safe, but B, make good decisions, which in many ways I think is the more important of the 2 goals. We have to monitor what our kids are involved with. This is a touchy subject for some parents. Monitor? We have to monitor? Yeah, we do. We actually have to monitor. And I've had teenagers and parents say, what? My kids are going to say I don't trust them. No, I trust you. Of all three of my kids, someday they will drive. And that terrifies me. Not because I think my kids aren't good drivers. I don't know. I mean, the oldest is 8. They may be terrible drivers. But if I have enough confidence to let them out on the streets, I'm going to assume they're pretty good drivers. And when ultimately they are driving, I will be a nervous wreck from the time they pull out of the driveway until the time I hear the car pull back in and the key goes in the front door. Why? Because there are other people on the road. My kid may be the best driver in the world, but there are a lot of idiots out there. The same is true online. So if our kids are saying, what, don't you trust me? Yeah, I trust you. I don't trust all those other folks out there and what they might be saying to you. Because just like if our kids were at school and they were being bullied or harassed or someone was doing something to them that we felt was an affront to their dignity, we would want to know. We would want to assist them. We would want to intervene. We would want to go and try to support them and show them how they should be treated. The same is true of our online encounters. If somebody is saying something inappropriate to them, we want to be there and help our kids. There are some apps and programs that I find to be particularly helpful. One is Covenant Eyes. So a lot of people ask me about blocking software. Should I put blocking software on the computer? Should I put blocking software on the phone? I wouldn't, for a couple of reasons. Blocking software isn't particularly effective. Does anyone here work for the NSA? Is anyone here an old-time computer hacker? Then all of your kids probably know more about technology than you do, mine included. It doesn't matter how good we think our passwords are, our kids have got those cracked, no problem. So blocking software, it basically, it's the equivalent of putting up a wall with a big gap on the side, and the kid goes, oh, I can't get in. And they just waltz right around it. I am much more in favor of accountability software. Accountability software basically says you can go wherever you want. And then I'm going to tell your parents about it. Or whoever the designated recipient is of the log of online activity. Because at the end of the day, or whatever time period, a log actually gets sent of where did the kids go and what happened. This is also good for another reason in terms of helping our kids make good decisions. It is really easy to make good decisions when you're on a proverbial desert island. Yeah, I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't drink, I didn't take any drugs, I didn't talk to anybody I shouldn't, because there's nothing here, because I'm sitting on a desert island. If kids don't have the opportunities to make poor choices, they can't learn to make good choices, because I've seen time and time again kids who are 15, 16, 17 who've had no access to anything because of restrictions and things that are blocked, go to college at 18 and flame out. Because suddenly they have access to everything and it's all unfettered and they haven't learned the prudence and the discipline to make good decisions. So we have to give our kids the opportunity to make good decisions and grow in virtue while they are there under our roof. So we can coach them and help them so by the time they are independent, making those good decisions is second nature to them. Other useful apps, Teen Safe, which can be found at teensafe.com. It's a monitor program that will monitor texts and web history and location, geographic location. It'll also keep track of call logs, contacts, bookmarks, and even messages from Kik and WhatsApp. MamaBearApp.com is another one. It's a monitoring program that looks at social media and texts. It does location sharing. It also does speed alerts. So if you've got a kid who's driving too fast, you'll know. Funny thing about speed alerts. So I had a very dear friend of mine. She and her husband, this is probably about 8 years ago, they just got smartphones. And they both realized on their shared plan, they had a Where's My Phone app that they could just see where the other person was, and it would give all sorts of information, including how fast they were going. So I'm there with my good friend, and she's showing me this app. And she was telling me this story that her husband had recently started riding his bike to work. And we were there, and she said, man, look at this. Bobby Bobby's going like 45 miles an hour. That's great. Well, she got home that night. Bobby had been knocked over while riding by another car. He was fine, but they called an ambulance because he had a bad sprain. So she saw the speed while he was being whisked off in the ambulance to urgent care to make sure he didn't have a concussion. So she came home and said, "Honey, you did great." He was like, "Thanks." So that's mamabearapp.com. WebWatcher is another one. This is also a very good one. WebWatcher is a monitor program for phones and computers. It'll work on Macs, Windows, Androids, iPhones. It'll cover your browsing history, searches, texts, calls, phones. What's really interesting about WebWatcher historically was that it was actually developed in 2002, and it was used as a counterterrorism software. So this counterterrorism software, 16 years later, is now commercially available to keep our kids safe. So that's how serious some of these programs are taking our children's safety, is that they were looking at something that was designed to keep our country safe, that we can now go ahead and keep our families safe. Beyond the software, the most important thing we can do is have conversations with our kids. With all of these accountability programs, they can be put on discreetly. They can run in the background and kids don't know that they're there. I am vehemently opposed to doing that because it shows an incredible level of distrust in our kids. If something is on there, I'm going to tell them, we're going to put this on there. Why? Because we want to create a culture of talking about our activities. Because if kids know it's okay to talk about this stuff, they'll come to us when they have a problem. And we want to frame all this not in a big brother is watching you, but a, look, we know this is part of your life. We just want to help you make the best choices, and we want to help make sure that other people are treating you right. So we want to talk about this. We want to talk about what a healthy and appropriate use of social media is, in the same way that we want to have conversations about drink driving or alcohol in general. By the time our kids go to college, they will probably have a couple of drinks when they're there. Now, I'm not saying that we want to sit them down at 14 and say, okay, this is what you need to do on alcohol, because that's not appropriate, but can we really talk about the idea of saying, how do you keep yourself safe so that when you're, again, 21 or 22, you're not doing something stupid like drinking and getting behind the wheel. And saying, if you've had a couple, have a friend drive you home. Get a cab. If you can't afford it, you call me and I will call Uber for you. Because I want you to make a good and safe decision. Think about the way that our homes are structured in terms of the physical hardware of our technology. Are all the internet accessible devices in public areas in the home? If we have computers, are the monitors against the wall, or are they facing out so that everybody can see what's going on? Are we okay with our kids having their iPads or iPhones or whatever their devices are in their rooms after 10 o'clock at night? I will say this, I don't know too many situations where I hear a parent tell me, oh yeah, my son went, all right, good night, Mom, I'm going to bed, it's 10. And then suddenly they're exhausted the next day. What were you doing? And I've had kids say this, oh man, I was up till like 3. Doing what? Watching YouTube. What were you watching? I don't know. Stuff. It's just becomes too much of a temptation and too much of a distraction. We don't need to have that upstairs. So I do think that we need to have internet accessible devices out of the bedrooms. I need it for homework. Okay, here's the living room. Here's the dining room table. You don't need it in your room. Similarly, we don't need electronic devices in the bathroom. This might be odd to say. There's water in the bathroom. And electronic devices are not cheap. And nothing feels worse than realizing that your phone just fell in the toilet and you've just destroyed $700 of very nice expensive equipment. Nothing needs to happen in the bathroom other than going to the bathroom and leaving. That's not the time that you go and text people. Personally, I don't think I would enjoy reading an email as much if I know that it was composed while someone was sitting on the bathroom than if I know that they were just sort of sitting at lunch having a sandwich and then sending me a picture of that sandwich. So, other things that we can do that I find very helpful. Set up charging stations. Have all the chargers in one place, maybe the kitchen island or there on the kitchen counter, and at 10 o'clock at night or whatever the time is for your family, everything goes there, everything gets charged. and it stays there. It's not in the bedroom. It's not, coming up to bed with us. It's just there. And that rule needs to go for everybody. If we're going to set house expectations, if we're going to set family rules, there cannot be two separate rules, one for the parents and one for the kids. Because rules that we set and do not follow, our children will blow off. This includes things like having phones at the table. Because kids will ignore you when you say, oh, no, this is a work email. I'm sending a work email now. This is, so you don't tweet to your friends on something because that's not it, but this is work. They don't see the difference. Because a lot of the times for kids, growing socially actually is work. That is their job as they grow and develop. So we have to be comfortable setting rules that all of us can abide by in the family. I mentioned earlier the importance of knowing who our kids are friends with, knowing who our kids are talking to. Can we also encourage our kids to spend more time with real-life people? Can we invite our kids to bring their friends over to our house? If they want to play video games, sure. Say, listen, okay, if you guys want to come over, I'll get a couple pizzas. You guys can play video games. It'll be great. Stay here. Or if you have a pool table, yeah, come on over, play pool. Making your house an engaging place so that kids are willing to stay at home and bring their friends there actually cultivates more opportunities for them to build genuine relationships with peers. Equally important to that is the active cultivation of family time. I know how busy we all are. I've lived in this area for nearly 2 decades. I've lived all over the country. I do not think there is an area anywhere else in the world where we are so overstressed, overbooked, and the expectations on our time are so high than in the DC area. And this affects our kids as well. But we need to make our families a priority. We need to make sure that we're putting time for the most important relationships in our lives. And time does not mean everybody's on the couch doing different things. We actually want to spend time together, connecting, having those genuine encounters I was talking about earlier when mentioning engaged families. Because if we don't spend time with our kids, someone else will. So in conclusion, I'd like to briefly mention a young man that I met in a practice in a different state who said one of the most remarkable things I have ever heard someone say. Not just ever heard an 8-year-old say, but anybody. One of the things we've been talking about was the idea that he really wished he had more time to spend with his family. And I thought, okay, he's 8. So what would you like to do? I mean, do you want to play Mario Kart? He said, no, I play Monopoly. Monopoly? This is an 8-year-old who wants to play Monopoly. Either we have a future CPA on our hands or this is just odd. And I said, okay, why do you want to play Monopoly? And he said something that I will never forget. And it is truly one of the wisest things I've ever heard anyone say. He said, when my family plays Monopoly, we can all see each other. He recognized that for his family, the board was in the middle, and the whole family was around the board, looking at each other while playing. When they would play video games, they're all staring at the wall. They're staring at the TV. But for this remarkable young man to recognize, when we do this activity, we have the ability to really go and connect with each other. What he was tapping into was 2 things. One, that desire for genuine encounter. And 2, the realization that the activity itself doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter if we're playing Monopoly, or going for a walk, or working in the garden together. Because at the root of that was a desire to spend time together without distraction, without interruption, without some other technology mediating that encounter, but to just be there and be present to the people who he loved best. So in conclusion, we want to be aware of the role that technology has, not just for our kids, but for ourselves, for our relationships as spouses, for our involvement with our kids as parents, and for the overall dynamic within the family. We must recognize that technology, as I said earlier, can be the steward of relationships, but it cannot be the source. It cannot be the primary form of encounter and interaction, because an encounter that is solely contained by technology can never truly be a genuine encounter that is grounded in a gift of self, where we are fully and completely present to the other. Technology runs the risk of separating us, while at the same time giving us the illusion that we're actually drawing closer. So we must be active in the decisions that we make. In those 5 years and 4 months of our lives, what do we choose to do with that time? Where is our priority? And will we rather stare at glowing screens or at each other? Thank you all.
So, right now we're gonna, the most interesting part of the evening is you all being able to share with one another, I guess, your insights and also your experiences you have with your own children. So what we'll do is, I think it's just easiest to just sort of stay in your tables, and maybe the ones that are fewer on them can join a table in the back. And then there's some questions there, and I guess if you want to answer those questions, or if anything else that caught your attention within the talk, I think are well worth sharing with one another and being able to share the wisdom. And then in about maybe 15 minutes, we will invite Dr. Horne to come back and we'll really ask questions. All right. Thank you.